The mysterious origin of the clogged drain. In late December 2022, in a bustling neighborhood on the outskirts of Brooklyn, New York, residents found themselves increasingly disturbed by an awful smell that seemed to linger in the air. At first, neighbors assumed it was just another case of someone leaving trash out too long or some poorly managed garbage collection. However, as the days crawled on, the smell grew more intense, creeping into homes through open windows and vents. It wasn't just a foul nuisance, it was suffocating, almost unnatural. Tensions began to rise among the residents. In casual hallway conversations, people started pointing fingers at each other. "It's definitely gotta be the restaurant on the corner," said Mrs. Hudson, a retiree from the third floor, waving her hand dismissively as she spoke to another tenant in the elevator. "Those dumpsters are always overflowing with spoiled meat. I called the city about it last week." Meanwhile, a young father, David Gomez, who lived on the second floor, insisted it wasn't the restaurant but something far worse brewing beneath their building. "I smelled the same thing coming from the basement 2 nights ago," he revealed to a group of tenants gathered in the lobby. "It's gotta be some sort of plumbing problem. No way this is just trash. It smells like something's rotting down there." By the end of that week, the stench had worsened to a revolting level. Some residents had even started avoiding going outside in the mornings because the smell was particularly strong then. Parents were growing worried as their children complained of nausea. The building's landlord, Chris Tenner, decided to step in after receiving a wave of complaints. Known for his laziness when it came to building maintenance, Chris initially downplayed the issue. He shrugged it off as a seasonal thing, claiming that severe temperature shifts often cause strange odors in older buildings. But now, with the smell threatening his tenants' sanity, Chris begrudgingly called in a drain cleaner named Eddie, a seasoned handyman who had worked on similar old New York apartment buildings many times before. Eddie arrived early one Saturday morning. The brisk winter wind cut through the neighborhood, and the snow piled awkwardly on sidewalks, reflecting the golden light of a rising sun. Eddie parked his rusted van near the building's service entrance, unloading a heavy toolbox and a motorized drain snake, while muttering to himself about people not taking care of their pipes. Chris greeted Eddie reluctantly, directing him through the damp basement corridors. The air down there was particularly still, and the smell, previously unbearable on upper floors, was nothing short of overpowering in this confined space. Eddie wrinkled his nose, but he wasn't new to dealing with bad smells. "Geez, you weren't kidding about the smell," he commented, shining his flashlight across the old rust-colored pipes lining the walls. Chris just grunted in reply, more focused on covering his nose with his scarf than responding. Eddie got to work near a narrow drain system along the far wall. The clogged area seemed to be in one of the main wastewater pipes. "This is a bad one, I'm telling you," Eddie muttered as he assessed the situation. He started feeding the drain snake into the pipe, adjusting as the machine struggled to move forward against an unusual blockage. His movement slowed when the tool suddenly stopped, hitting something hard. Something that didn't feel like a typical clog. He frowned, turning off the machine. Curious and slightly uneasy, Eddie grabbed his tools and plunged his gloved hands into the murky, icy water pooled around the pipe. As he began to pull up fragments of the blockage, his hand brushed against something oddly textured. It was slippery, yet rigid. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, fishing out what appeared to be a large hunk of rotting flesh. Eddie was no stranger to weird discoveries in city plumbing. Animal carcasses, wads of fabric, and even kids' lost toys often turned up in backed-up drains. But this was different. The flesh smelled putrid and had streaks of dried blood still visible beneath the grime. He pulled it closer under the flashlight and froze when he saw shards of what unmistakably looked like bone protruding from the edges. Something deep inside Eddie's gut told him this wasn't some prank or an unfortunate roadkill incident. He dropped the chunk of flesh back into the water in shock. His face turned pale as he wiped his damp gloves on his overalls, his breath coming faster. Looking to Chris, who stood a few feet away nervously fidgeting with his phone, Eddie called out, "Hey, Mr. Landlord, you're gonna want to see this. And maybe call the cops." Chris hesitated, the color draining from his face as he nervously approached. "What is it? Please tell me it's just a dead rat or something." "It's not a rat," Eddie replied darkly, pulling out another piece of the blockage. This time it was even worse. A clump of hair attached to a patch of human scalp. Chris stumbled back, gagging as the stench and sight overwhelmed him. Eddie stood up straight, wiping his sweaty forehead despite the cold atmosphere. He locked eyes with Chris and said grimly, "You better get the authorities here fast. I think we just found something a hell of a lot worse than clogged pipes." The gruesome discovery. A body in the drain. When the police arrived at the building's dingy basement on that freezing December evening, the smell hit them like a ton of bricks. Officers Miguel Ortega and Sarah Collins, both seasoned detectives from the New York City Police Department, exchanged uneasy glances as they stepped into the poorly lit corridor. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a smell neither of them ever got used to despite years on the force. "Jesus, it's worse than I imagined," Ortega muttered, pulling his scarf tighter over his face. "Worse than the garbage docks on the west side," Collins replied, keeping her flashlight steady as she scanned the walls and floor. "If we're smelling it this strong, whatever's in that pipe has to be fresh." Eddie, the drain cleaner, stood a few feet away, nervously fidgeting with his gloves. He was still pale, his earlier composure shaken from what he'd uncovered. He pointed toward the open drain where the blockage had been partially cleared. "It's in there. I didn't want to pull out too much more. You'll see why in a second," Eddie said, his voice uneven. Collins lifted an eyebrow, approaching the pipe cautiously. She turned to Ortega, her partner. "You ready for this?" "Yeah," Ortega said, though his tone lacked confidence. "Let's do it. But God help me if it's another raccoon messing with us." Eddie shook his head vigorously, stepping back. "It's not a raccoon, I can promise you that." With a resigned shrug, Collins crouched down, using her gloved hand to sift through the murky, foul-smelling water pooling around the drain. She winced as her fingers brushed something fleshy and unnaturally soft. Slowly pulling it out into the light, she froze the moment the object became visible. A gelatinous pale chunk of what looked like human tissue sat in her palm. Blood and grime clung to it, and from one side extended an unmistakable sliver of yellowed bone. "Oh my, this is human," Collins whispered, holding it closer to her flashlight. "You sure?" Ortega asked, leaning over her shoulder, though the look on his face suggested he was already convinced of her assessment. She shot him a look. 100%. Eddie spoke up, his voice trembling. "That's not even the worst of it. Look over there." He pointed to a pile of debris he'd set aside earlier. Bits of fabric, more unidentifiable tissue, and the telltale graying strands of what could only be human hair. The piece de resistance, however, was a clump of what unmistakably appeared to be part of a human scalp, complete with matted, blood-soaked hair. Ortega stepped back instinctively, raising a hand to his nose and mouth. "Oh hell no, that's not something out of a damn health textbook," he said, his voice edged with shock. "How long do you think this has been sitting in here?" Collins placed the tissue chunk back and pulled herself to her feet. "Not long if the smell is this bad," she replied grimly. Whatever this was, happened recently." She turned on Eddie, who was still shivering a few feet away. "You said you didn't touch anything else in here, right?" "Not a damn thing," Eddie stammered. "I knew as soon as I pulled that out that this wasn't some kind of normal clog. I swear the moment I saw it I knew this is serious. It's not like I don't see weird stuff in drains all the time, but this is messed up." "You were right to call us," Collins said, nodding. "Don't go anywhere. We'll need your statement after this." Ortega sighed, his breath visible in the cold basement air. "You think this is a one-off, or is there more where this came from?" Collins didn't respond immediately. Instead, she returned her flashlight to the drain's dark opening, scanning the murky depths inside. Her heart sank when she caught the faint glimmer of something metallic, like a zipper, half buried in the sludge further down the pipe. "Oh, there's more," she muttered. "We're looking at a crime scene, not just a clogged drain." "Call CSU," Ortega told Eddie. "We're gonna need a full forensic team down here." Still shaking but obedient, Eddie pulled out his phone, fumbling to dial as Collins continued to inspect the drain. She couldn't shake the growing knot in her stomach as the pieces of the story began falling into place. If body parts were being found here in the basement, how had they gotten into the plumbing in the first place? And more importantly, why had no one reported a missing person? The forensics team arrives within an hour. The basement was swarming with activity. Blue and white police tape lines cordoned off the area, while photographers and forensic analysts meticulously documented every grim detail. Large fans were brought in to dissipate the unbearable smell, though it did little to ease the queasiness etched on every officer's face. Collins watched as one of the technicians used a pair of long metal tongs to extract more pieces from the drain. They placed each fragment carefully into evidence bags, which were sealed immediately to preserve any DNA or other forensic materials. It didn't take long for them to piece together a horrifying realization. The remains weren't from just one person. "Detective, we've got multiple tissue samples here," one technician reported, his face pale. "Different stages of decomposition, too. This isn't one victim, we're looking at more, probably several. Jesus Christ, Ortega muttered, pacing the room. How the hell does this happen here in freaking Brooklyn? This isn't some backwoods horror movie, it's New York. Welcome to the city that never sleeps, Collins replied sarcastically, though her tone lacked levity. Apparently, our killer didn't sleep either. The evidence piling up suggested the gruesome truth. Someone had been using the building's drainage system to dump body parts. The questions were endless. Who could do something this sick? How did no one notice sooner? And most pressing of all, how many victims were there? Collins drew a deep breath, turning to Ortega. We need to interview every tenant in this building, starting with the guy who lives closest to this drain. Yeah, Ortega replied. And I'm betting whoever's responsible didn't go far. You don't just casually kill and chop up multiple people without leaving some breadcrumbs behind. That's what I'm afraid of, Collins said. Her gaze lingered on the mess of gray hair and dried flesh lying next to the drain. I think we're just getting started. The suspect emerges. As far as I'm concerned, nobody's innocent until proven otherwise, Officer Miguel Ortega muttered under his breath as he sidestepped the yellow police tape in the dimly lit basement. The unsettling stench still clung to the air even after the forensics team had already packed up most of their equipment. Detectives Ortega and Sarah Collins stood shoulder to shoulder, reviewing the tenant list of the building with grim expressions in the flickering fluorescent light. So, who do we start with? Collins asked, flipping through the clipboard containing names and floor numbers. Her eyebrows furrowed in concentration. Ortega scratched his stubbled chin, eyeing the list skeptically. Closest to the drain are these two units, B2 and B3, he noted, tapping the paper with his pen. I say we go door to door, but let's start low. B2 looks like it's where the majority of the complaints originated. You mean the residents who called to complain about the smell? Collins asked, looking up with a sharp gaze. Ortega nodded. Right, either they're very unlucky or very involved. First stop, apartment B2. The hallway leading to B2 was eerily quiet. A busted light fixture above flickered sporadically, adding to the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Ortega knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing unnaturally through the corridor. It took a full minute before footsteps slowly approached from behind the door. A chain rattled, followed by a loud series of deadbolts sliding open. When the door finally creaked ajar, an elderly woman peeked out through the small gap. Are you from the gas company? She croaked, her voice raspy and wary. No ma'am, NYPD, Ortega replied, flashing his badge. We're investigating a situation in the building. Can we ask you a few questions? The woman's pale blue eyes darted nervously between Ortega and Collins. Something about that awful smell? She asked cautiously. Yes, exactly, Collins said, her tone even and calming. We understand you've reported it before. Do you have any suspicions about where it might be coming from? The woman hesitated, her lips trembling slightly. I never get involved with the other tenants, you know, she said after a long pause. People today, it's best to keep your nose out of their business. Ortega leaned casually against the doorframe but cast her a piercing look. We're not here to drag you into trouble, ma'am, but if you've noticed anything, strange behavior, unusual smells, odd deliveries, it could help us get to the bottom of this. Well, the woman hesitated again, but then her voice dropped to a near whisper as though afraid someone else might overhear her. B3. The people in B3. That young man and his girlfriend. They keep strange hours. Late nights, shady folks coming and going. Sometimes I hear noises, banging and dragging sounds coming from their place. Like something heavy. Collins immediately locked eyes with Ortega. B3? She repeated, marking it on the clipboard. Anything else you've noticed about them? I try to keep my nose out of it, but the girl, smiles too much, you know? The fake kind of smile. The old woman pressed her lips together tightly, then muttered, and the boy, well, he gives me chills. His eyes, they're too dead, there's something wrong with him. Collins nodded sympathetically, thanking the woman before stepping back. We appreciate it, ma'am. If you think of anything else, don't hesitate to let us know. The shadows around apartment B3. The detective stood outside B3, the air in the corridor feeling even colder. Ortega rapped his knuckles sharply on the door. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. NYPD, we need to ask you some questions. Silence. Collins glanced at Ortega, then tilted her head toward the faint sound coming from inside the unit. Hear that? She whispered. It was distant, faint, like shuffling feet or soft murmuring. They're in there, Ortega muttered, reaching for his radio. Dispatch, this is Ortega. We'll need backup at 89 Croft Avenue, Unit B3. Possible suspects present. Proceeding with caution until units arrive. Collins tried the doorknob. Locked. Figures. Ortega crouched, setting his ear against the door. Whatever they're doing in there, they're being awfully careful about it. Or they're trying to destroy evidence, Collins said grimly, motioning toward the handle. Let's not waste another second. A nervous introduction. Within 5 minutes backup arrived and the detectives prepared to breach the door. But just as they were about to act, the lock clicked. The door opened slightly, and a man's head peeked out. He was in his early 30s, clean-shaven, with sharp features and tired, sunken eyes. His expression was cold yet cautious. A weird calmness exuded from him. "Can I help you?" Jack Miller asked. Collins held up her badge. "Detectives from NYPD. We have a few questions regarding the complaints coming from this building. Do you live here?" Jack nodded lazily as if bored. "Yeah, me and my girlfriend. What's this about?" Ortega leaned forward, his imposing figure just inches from the doorframe. "We're investigating something pretty serious, Mr. Miller. Mind if we come in?" Jack's brow furrowed, as if deliberating his options. Then he shrugged. Sure, why not?" He opened the door wider, revealing a compact but cluttered apartment. The coffee table was piled with sketchbooks, fast food containers, and what looked like boxes of cleaning supplies. Jack stepped aside and let the detectives enter. "It's a mess," he admitted, forcing a small laugh. "We've been doing some redecorating." Collins glanced around sharply. Her eyes scanned every surface, the cheap furniture, the piles of newspapers in the corner, the faint smell of bleach lingering in the air. Something felt off. Too sterile. Too practiced. "Where's your girlfriend?" Collins asked casually. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. "Lisa's at work. She's got the late shift at a diner down the block." Ortega raised an eyebrow. "Mind if we look around?" Jack's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his calm facade. "Knock yourself out, officer." A growing suspicion. As Collins wandered toward the kitchen, Ortega stayed behind with Jack, watching his every move. Jack leaned casually against the wall, trying to appear unfazed, but there was tension in the way his fingers drummed the edge of the doorframe. Collins peered into the open garbage can where she saw scrunched-up plastic gloves and empty detergent bottles. Her stomach churned, but she said nothing. "Do you mind explaining," Ortega began, crossing his arms, "why your neighbors keep hearing banging noises coming from here at odd hours? Or why the basement drain just so happens to be clogged with, let's say, unusual material?" Jack's mask of indifference slipped slightly, a flicker of irritation on his face, but he quickly recovered. "No idea what you're talking about. Maybe you should try asking the restaurant downstairs," he replied smoothly, shifting on his feet. Ortega didn't respond immediately. His silence was calculated, his gaze dark and penetrating. Jack held his stare defiantly. The interrogation wouldn't take long. Ortega could feel it in his gut. Jack and Lisa, they were hiding something big. The drain cleaner's revelations. The meeting with Eddie detectives Miguel Ortega and Sarah Collins sat across from Eddie in one of the precinct's small interrogation rooms. The walls were painted a cold, institutional gray, and the single overhead light buzzed faintly. Eddie, still wearing his faded green jacket and boots crusted with the sludge of the basement, looked visibly shaken. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the styrofoam cup of coffee the officers had offered him, though he hadn't taken a single sip. "Take your time, Eddie," Collins began gently, her tone soft and encouraging. "We just need you to walk us through what you saw. What happened down there in the basement?" Eddie nodded, but didn't speak right away. He stared into the cup of untouched coffee as if it held the answers. "Look," Ortega interjected, leaning forward, his deep voice breaking the silence. "We've all seen some crazy stuff on the job, okay? I've pulled bodies out of rivers and seen things at crime scenes that would make most people lose their lunch. Whatever it was you found, we can handle it. We just need to hear it from you." Eddie finally glanced up, his eyes bloodshot and heavy. He let out a sharp breath. "You don't get it," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I've worked as a plumber in this city for 20 damn years. I've seen all the weird shit people flush down their pipes. Diapers, wedding rings, dead rats, you name it. But this was different." "What did you see?" Collins leaned in slightly, her notebook ready. "Different how?" she asked with measured curiosity. Eddie shook his head as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare. He clenched his hands together tightly, the lines of grime in his fingernails serving as evidence of the long hours he'd spent in the basement. "It wasn't trash," he said slowly. "I mean, I thought it was at first. A big blockage of leftover food, maybe. Hell, I even figured someone dumped a dead dog or something. But it wasn't an animal? Ortega pressed, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Eddie looked at Ortega, his expression twisted with unease. No, it wasn't. It was... He hesitated, swallowing hard before continuing. The first thing I pulled out was a chunk of meat. I thought it was bad pork or something. But when I looked closer, damn, it had skin. Human skin. And bone. Collins wrote down every word, her face betraying no visible reaction. You're certain about that? Human remains? I know what I saw, Eddie snapped, then immediately caught himself. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I'm sure, okay? You don't forget something like that. When things took a darker turn. Anything else you pulled out of the drain? Ortega asked, his voice steady. Eddie nodded, his lips tight. Yeah, hair, clumps of it, and not from a dog or a cat. Long dark hair. I found chunks of scalp attached to it. That's when I realized this wasn't some messed up prank or roadkill. It was murder. Collins and Ortega exchanged a quick glance. It wasn't the first time they'd encountered a killer who tried to dispose of bodies by unconventional means, but flushing human remains down the building's plumbing system, that was rare, even for New York. Why didn't you call it in right then and there? Ortega asked, his tone growing more direct. I was about to, Eddie confessed, his hands tightening around the coffee cup again. But I didn't feel safe. When I found the scalp, I told the landlord to come have a look, and that's when I saw him. Saw who? Collins asked. A suspicious encounter. Him, Eddie repeated, his voice lowering conspiratorially as if the walls themselves were listening. Tall, thin guy with dark hair, maybe early 30s. He was lurking near the basement door like he was watching me. Did you talk to him? Ortega leaned forward, his penetrating gaze fixed on Eddie. No, Eddie said quickly and instinctively. I didn't talk to him. He didn't exactly seem friendly. He looked at me, just for a split second, but there was something wrong about him. Cold. Like he didn't care that I was pulling body parts out of his drain, like he'd already known they were there. Okay, did you get a good look at him? Can you describe anything else? Collins asked, her pen poised. Yeah, Eddie said, squinting as if replaying the moment in his mind. He was wearing a brown jacket, looked kind of ratty, had these deep-set eyes, real dead-looking, you know what I mean? Like he wasn't all there, and his hands were in his pockets the whole time, like he didn't want anyone to see them. Did he say anything? Ortega asked. No, Eddie replied, shaking his head. But right before he walked away he smirked at me, like he knew a secret I didn't. Sent chills right down my spine. Collins jotted down notes frantically, her own face locked in concentration as she absorbed every word Eddie said. A critical detail revealed. After that I cleaned up what I could and called you guys, Eddie said, his voice faltering slightly toward the end. Before he left, Collins interrupted gently. Did this man, the one in the basement, go anywhere specific? Did you notice what direction he went? Eddie hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, he went up the service staircase. Could have been heading to any floor, but the direction he was moving in, it felt sure, like he already knew where he was going. That's good, Collins assured, giving him a tight smile. Anything else you remember, no matter how small, could help us. Well, Eddie hesitated again, his brows furrowing as he seemed to recall something. After he disappeared, I overheard him on the phone. I couldn't catch everything, but he said something like, "It's taken care of for now." And then he got quieter. I didn't want to stick around and listen after that. Ortega scribbled something quickly on his notepad. All right, Eddie, you've done a good job talking to us. We're going to keep you safe. If anyone else approaches you or threatens you, anything, you call us immediately. Eddie gave a solemn nod but didn't look convinced. Do you guys think this is some kind of killer, like one of those serial creeps you see on the news? Collins broke eye contact, her lips pursed. We don't jump to conclusions, she said, her words slow and careful. But we'll find out. Eddie's farewell. The detectives escorted Eddie outside after taking his full statement. He turned back to them nervously. You're gonna catch them, right? Whoever did this. We'll catch them, Ortega responded firmly, his deep voice resonating with confidence. You better, Eddie muttered, his shoulders slumping as he walked off into the cold New York night. Because there's no way in hell I'm ever going near another drain again. The pursuit and thorough investigation. We're burning daylight. Detectives Miguel Ortega and Sarah Collins didn't need to exchange more than a glance to know where their investigation needed to head next. With the information Eddie had provided, paired with the strange tension in Jack and Lisa's apartment, the urgency was palpable. Back in the precinct bullpen, Collins pulled up a detailed map of the building and pinned it against the corkboard in their shared workspace. All right, she began, circling key areas surrounding the drain system. We've got two problems to solve. One, She tapped her marker on the basement corner. How did body parts end up clogging this drain? 2. Her focus shifted to the rest of the map. How far does this thing go? Could this be connected to other incidents we're not seeing yet? Ortega leaned back in his chair, sipping a now cold coffee that had been abandoned during the morning chaos. Let's start with what we do know. Our witnesses point fingers at Jack and Lisa in B3, and something about that jackass doesn't sit right with me. He tossed a printed tenant record on the desk. Jack Miller, 32 years old, no priors, but that doesn't make him squeaky clean. He's got a couple of noise complaints from his neighbors, disturbances late at night, heavy banging, things being dragged across floors. What about her? Collins asked, pointing toward the file marked with Lisa Carter's name. She seems quieter from what we've heard, but those types often are. Any history? Typical small-town girl, Ortega replied, scanning the records. Moved to the city 3 years ago. Waitressing jobs here and there, nothing remarkable on paper. Only thing is... He paused, eyeing the last line of text in her file. She doesn't have a listed next of kin or emergency contact anywhere. That doesn't give us much, Collins sighed, but her shoulders straightened as she glanced at the nearby stack of reports gathered by CSU. But this does. Let's start connecting dots. The forensic clues. The basement of 89 Croft Avenue had been transformed overnight into a full-scale forensic operation. CSU, crime scene unit, unearthed a pipeline of disturbing clues, small fragments of bone, pieces of teeth, fibers from clothing, and even faint traces of industrial bleach left lingering in the system. What do you make of it? Collins asked as she knelt beside one of the CSU specialists, watching as he carefully sealed another evidence bag with tweezers. We've seen similar setups before, but not like this, the technician replied, his gloved hands deftly wrapping the bag. These pipes weren't just an afterthought. Someone dumped this stuff here over time. It wasn't rushed. That doesn't line up with your average panic dump, Ortega added, arms crossed as he scanned the room. If someone panics, they're tossing a few things and making a run for it. This setup feels calculated. That's because it is, the tech chimed in. We found markings on some of the flesh we pulled out, clean cuts, surgical almost. Whoever did this wasn't just careless. They knew what they were doing. Ortega's gaze darkened. Surgical? Great. So now we're looking at someone with skills in dismemberment? A medical job, maybe? Not necessarily professional, the tech corrected, but practiced. This wasn't their first time. The search warrant armed with more evidence and mounting suspicions. Ortega and Collins moved quickly to obtain a search warrant for Jack and Lisa's apartment. The next morning was a flurry of paperwork, tense conversations with district judges, and orchestrating the right timing. By mid-afternoon they were standing outside the unassuming door of B3, surrounded by a SWAT team ready to breach. Remember, Collins said to the team as the battering ram came forward, we're not just looking for blood. Small things matter. Anything that connects locations, tools, victims, keep your eyes sharp. The ram smashed through the cheap wooden door, sending splinters flying into the dimly lit apartment. What greeted them was unnervingly still. Jack and Lisa were gone. Clear, an officer called from the bedroom. Clear, another voice echoed from the tiny kitchen. Collins stepped inside, her eyes scanning over the mildly cluttered space. It wasn't much different from their earlier visit. Empty Chinese takeout boxes, newspapers stacked on a shaky coffee table, but now it had an eerie emptiness. It felt staged, like people had left in a hurry, leaving behind only what they didn't care about. Here's something, Ortega called from the bathroom, his voice lowered. Collins moved across the apartment to find him holding up a box of industrial-grade bleach and rubber gloves, shoved carelessly beneath a sink. The faint chemical smell still clung to the air. That matches what CSU found in the pipes, she said, her mind spinning. They're already cleaning up after themselves. This isn't their first time. Her attention was pulled to something else, a large duffel bag leaning against the sink. She crouched and unzipped it carefully. Inside were tools. Knife sets wrapped in clean cloth, a small, lightweight saw, heavy-duty trash bags barely folded. Tools for taking things apart, she muttered grimly. And putting them away, Ortega added, his tone lined with disgust. Hunting Jack and Lisa. By the time their fieldwork was done, the case had become clear. Jack and Lisa needed to be brought in, and fast. Back at the precinct, Collins stared at her board of evidence, piecing together their movements. The drain, the tools, the late-night noises, the lack of family ties. It all painted a picture of two people deeply ensnared in something dark. Ortega slammed a fresh stack of documents onto her desk, phone records retrieved that afternoon. They made calls to a burner phone 3 towns over, he said. Consistent patterns every week. It looks like they've got help, or at least a hideout. Let's track it, she replied without hesitation. Every lead, every connection. We don't give them room to run. As the officers mobilized for what was shaping up to be a manhunt, one thing was becoming glaringly relevant. This wasn't just a horrific crime scene or small-time killers trying to keep their secrets. Jack and Lisa had a system, and the cracks in their method were only just starting to show. Lisa's chilling confession. The interrogation room. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound in the otherwise silent interrogation room. Lisa Carter sat across from detectives Miguel Ortega and Sarah Collins, her hands cuffed to the metal table. Dressed in a gray hoodie and jeans that could barely hide her frailty, she looked far from the monster they'd been hunting. Her face was pale, her dark hair disheveled, and her eyes sunken, yet there was still something cold, something calculating in the way she sat there, completely still. It wasn't fear, it was resignation. Collins leaned against the back wall of the room, her arms folded across her chest. Ortega broke the silence as he pulled up his chair, the scrape against the floor deliberate, meant to break the tension. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the table in front of Lisa, letting it flop open. Inside were photographs, gruesome, damning photographs of what they had pulled from the basement drain, from the duffel bag in her apartment, and even screenshots from the disturbing videos they had found on Jack's laptop. I don't need to tell you what we're looking at, Lisa, Ortega began, his deep voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and restrained fury. You already know. What I need from you is simple. The truth. Start talking. Lisa's dry lips barely twitched, but her eyes remained fixed on the table. Collins pushed off the wall and stepped forward, placing her palms flat on the metal surface. Lisa, this is your chance. Right now you can save yourself, or you can go down with him, with Jack. We already know what's in the videos. We already know whose remains are in that drain. What we need from you is the why. Why did this happen? Why did you let it happen? Lisa's eyes finally shifted upward, locking onto Collins with a vacant stare. Her voice came out flat, eerily calm. Let it happen? She repeated, almost mocking. Her lips curled slightly into an empty smirk. You think this was all Jack? A chilling perspective. Ortega leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. So you're saying it wasn't all him? That's not the impression you gave your neighbors, Lisa. Late night noises, the dragging, the bleach, it's all you and Jack, no one else. What's your story? Lisa exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. The story, she said slowly, as if she was savoring the words. The story is that Jack thought we were doing this because of the money. At first, that's what I let him believe. Collins raised an eyebrow. What are you saying? I'm saying we didn't do this just because we needed the cash, Lisa replied, leaning slightly forward now. Her tone was even, controlled, like someone recounting an old memory. Sure, that's how it started. Some bills, some debts, same old story, right? Jack came up with the plan to go after nobodies. Homeless men, kids from the edges of the city, people no one would notice were gone, take their stuff, make a quick getaway. But it didn't stay about the money, Ortega said, his jaw tightening. Did it? Lisa smiled, soft at first, then wider, more unsettling. Oh, detective, people like you love tying everything into neat little motives, don't you? It was for the money. It was a crime of passion. You want there to be a reason, something you can file away in your reports so you can go home at night and tell yourselves the world makes sense. Don't play games with us, Lisa, Collins said sharply. This wasn't just random, so why? Why target them? They were weak, Lisa answered simply with a shrug. Weak, pathetic, lost. People who should have been put out of their misery already. We just gave them a push. Whoever crossed our path, whoever looked like no one would miss them. They were too easy. The shift from survival to thrill Ortega felt a wave of nausea twist his stomach as he leaned back in his chair. Collins, however, pressed further, her tone hardening. So what? You're trying to tell us you were doing them a favor? That this was some sick version of charity? No, Lisa said coolly. It wasn't for them. It was for us. Us, Ortega repeated, narrowing his eyes. You and Jack. Lisa nodded slowly, though her gaze dropped slightly to the folder in front of her. The first one was messy, she admitted. We didn't know what we were doing, but we didn't care. After it was over, we sat there, covered in blood, shaking. You'd think it would have broken us, right? That it would drive us apart? She laughed bitterly, the sound grating against the silence. But it didn't. It brought us closer. Collins felt her skin crawl as she asked the inevitable question. Closer how? Lisa's response was immediate, and it chilled the air in the room. Because we realized we were good at it. And more than that, we liked it. No, we loved it. No, Ortega said, his voice almost a growl. You're not going to sit there and tell me you loved cutting people into pieces, flushing them down drains like garbage. Lisa met his eyes, her gaze cold and unwavering. Why not? You've seen the pictures, haven't you? You think we kept pieces of them just because we were sentimental? Collins threw her hand up, visibly bristling. Enough, she snapped. Lisa, you've got two choices right now. You come clean. Everything, everyone who helped you, how it started, where the others are, or this whole damn case goes solely on you, and we make damn sure the jury knows your name before Jack's. Do you really think he's going to protect you? Do you really think he's not throwing you under the bus as we speak? The confession begins. Lisa's demeanor finally cracked, just a little. Her smirk faltered, her fingernails tapped nervously against the table. Jack wouldn't, she faltered, then stared at her reflection in the steel table. For the first time her voice sank to a whisper. Would he? Collins exchanged a glance with Ortega, sensing an opening. He absolutely would, Collins said evenly. You know he would. He's already painting you as an accomplice, Lisa. He's already talking, right now. If you think protecting him will keep you safe, you're a bigger fool than he is. Lisa was silent for a long moment, her fingers still. Then, slowly, she straightened her back, her voice colder than ever but strangely calm now. Fine, she said. What do you want to know? Everything, Ortega said bluntly. Who helped you, where the other victims are, and why. No games. Lisa exhaled, her shoulders sagging just slightly. Her answer, when it came, was emotionless, as though she were reading aloud from a grocery list. 6 people. That's how many, homeless, all of them. Easy targets. We'd take them up to the apartment, tell them we had a job or food for them, make them comfortable, then... She dragged her words out, savoring the tension. Then we took care of them. That's not taking care of them, Ortega snapped. That's torture! Lisa smirked again, her face regaining its icy composure. Call it what you want. Keep talking, Collins demanded. Where's Jack now? Oh, you'll find him soon enough, Lisa replied, almost casually. But I promise you, detective, you won't like what he has to say. Jack isn't one for loyalty. A chilling silence. The room went silent, the weight of Lisa's words pressing down like a storm cloud. For Collins and Ortega, one thing was clear. They weren't just dealing with murderers. They were dealing with monsters. The couple's targets, vulnerable victims inside the interrogation room. The room smelled faintly of bleach and cold steel. Lisa Carter sat with her hands cuffed to the table, her dark eyes trained on Detective Collins, but her expression betrayed no emotion. Detective Ortega paced behind Collins, the sound of his boots on the tiled floor sharp and deliberate, as he processed Lisa's latest confession. You're saying your victims weren't chosen at random? That these people were targeted specifically? Collins leaned forward, her tone calm, yet pointed. Break it down for us, Lisa. Why them? Lisa tilted her head, almost amused by the question. Why not them? She replied, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. The world threw them away. I mean, look at them, the folks in shelters, sleeping under bridges, begging for scraps. No one notices when they disappear. Hell, no one even notices when they're there. We're not asking about what the world thinks, Ortega cut in, his tone sharp as a knife. We're asking about you. Why pick these people to kill? Why go after the vulnerable? Lisa shrugged, as though the explanation was obvious. Because they're easy, she said flatly. Think about it. For as long as humans have been around, the strong prey on the weak. A lion doesn't chase gazelles faster than it, detective. It goes for the slowest one, the one limping. It's natural. Hunting Grounds Collins's chair scraped against the floor as she leaned back, giving Lisa a moment to let those words linger. Ortega stopped pacing, spinning around to face Lisa head-on. Let me guess, Ortega began, his arms crossing over his chest. You weren't just strolling down the streets waiting for these gazelles to fall into your lap. You had hunting grounds, didn't you? Lisa's smirk widened, though her eyes remained cold and detached. We didn't need to look far. New York City dumps them on every corner. Homeless shelters, soup kitchens, subway stations late at night. You'd be amazed how easy it is to lure someone with a spare cup of coffee and a little sympathy. Ortega muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. But Collins wasn't ready to let the moment pass. Sympathy, she spat the word. You expect us to believe you gave a damn about these people? No, Lisa said sharply, her voice cutting like glass. I expect you to believe people like that don't have a choice. They're desperate enough to trust the stranger who smiles at them, offers them a hot meal, tells them they've got a job or a warm place to stay. Jack was good at that part. He could sell anyone a dream. Jack's role in the hunt. Jack, Ortega repeated, narrowing his eyes. He was the charmer? Lisa laughed under her breath, not out of humor but something darker. Not charming, just convincing. He knew how to read people, you know, the way their eyes would light up just a little when he'd mention a warm bed or a paycheck. God, the things people will believe when they're too cold or too hungry to question it. And you? Collins pressed, her pen hovering over her notebook. What was your role in all this, Lisa? Were you just there to snatch the bait once Jack reeled them in? Lisa's face hardened slightly, the smirk fading. Oh no, I'm not a bystander in my own story, Detective, she said, her voice low and steady. I did my part. Once Jack got them to trust us, he'd bring them back to the apartment. That's where I came in. I'd make sure they stayed. Stayed? Ortega raised an eyebrow. That isn't in the damn pamphlet, Lisa. Tell us what really happened. The apartment becomes a trap. There was a pause as Lisa leaned back in her chair, almost as if she were reminiscing. You'd be surprised how easy it was to get their guard down, she began. The first thing we'd do was make them comfortable, give them something warm to drink, let them sit on the couch, offer them a shower if they wanted. The smell of clean soap does wonders for convincing someone they're safe. Some of them even smiled, said they hadn't felt that human in years. Collins could feel bile rising in her throat. The casual tone Lisa used made it sound like she was describing an interior design project, not a crime scene. And then? Collins asked, her tone cracking slightly. Then? Lisa echoed, almost mockingly. We'd slip something into their drink. No big production, just enough to make them sleepy, disoriented. Once they were out, Jack, well, let's just say Jack was the one who decided when the fun began. Fun? Ortega barked, his voice rising as he slammed a hand down on the table. You call this fun? Oh, don't act so righteous, Lisa hissed back, her smirk returning. I see how this works. The two of you get to sit here, pretend you're the moral authority, like you haven't seen worse. But deep down, you're fascinated, aren't you? You want to know what we did, how we did it, what it felt like. You want the details. No one's fascinated, Lisa, Collins snapped, though inwardly she felt a crack in her resolve. Lisa's calmness, her lack of shame, it was digging under her skin. We're disgusted. There's a difference. The weak is prey. Lisa waved a cuffed hand dismissively, her nails tapping against the table. Fine, be disgusted. But you want to know why we picked them? Because it felt good. The way they flinched when they realized, just for a moment, that it wasn't going to end well for them. That's why, not the money, not the desperation. It was control. When's the last time you had real control, Detective? When's the last time you didn't answer to someone else or let the clock dictate your choices? So you're saying they were target practice? Ortega fired back. Weaker than you. That's why you did it? Not just target practice, Lisa replied sharply. They made it easy. No one looked for them. No one called the cops. No tear-filled vigils or candlelit prayers. They were invisible, right up until they ended up in the drain. The justification. Collins felt her jaw tighten. You think you're some kind of philosopher, don't you? Justifying slaughter with fairy tale metaphors about nature and survival. There's nothing grand about what you did. It's pathetic. Lisa raised an eyebrow, her smirk unwavering. Spoken like someone who's never felt real power. But that's fine. I don't expect you to understand. People like you live in the rules. You're not like us. Collins leaned in, her eyes lighting with fire. No, Lisa, we're nothing like you. You pick on the defenseless. You twist their lives into something disposable. And that's why you're here, cuffed to the table, spilling your soul into my notebook instead of walking the streets targeting someone else. Lisa tilted her head, watching Collins for a moment before sitting back, a new calm falling over her. If you say so, Detective. The reality. As Ortega and Collins stepped out of the room, Lisa's face burned in their minds. What they'd just heard wasn't just a confession. It was a window into the twisted brutality that hid behind her cold, calculating exterior. Homeless and desperate souls, treated like animals in a jungle. She's a predator, Ortega muttered as they headed toward their desks. Collins agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. And she picked a jungle no one watches. The crimes turn into pleasure. The shift in motive. From survival to joy. The interrogation room was silent except for the soft buzz of the overhead fluorescent lights. Lisa Carter sat across from Detectives Miguel Ortega and Sarah Collins, her posture loose, as if she were in no hurry to leave. Her cuffs clinked softly as she shifted in her seat, that infamous chilling smirk playing on her lips. You know, Lisa began casually, breaking the oppressive quiet, it didn't start the way you think. Her tone was conversational, almost as if she were reminiscing over an old memory. There was a terrifying calm in her voice. Collins leaned forward, her pen tucked away for the moment. She didn't want to miss a thing Lisa said. Ortega, standing near the corner of the room, crossed his arms and watched her like a predator sizing up prey. "All right, Lisa." Ortega's tone was sharp, but his attempt to control his disgust made his voice shake slightly. "Start talking. If it didn't start the way we think, then how did it start? Because so far you're not painting yourself as the victim in this story." Lisa smiled faintly at that, her dark eyes almost gleaming with a twisted spark of amusement. "It was Jack's idea at first. You know, the whole thing about taking whatever we could from people no one would miss. He always talked about survival of the fittest, about getting ahead." She paused, letting those words hang in the air. "At first, I thought it made sense. We had bills. Rent was overdue. It's always something, right?" She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "So it was about survival," Collins said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of anger. "What changed?" Lisa tilted her head, considering the question like she was deciding how much of the truth to share. "The first time was messy," she admitted slowly, her voice almost reflective. "We didn't plan it out perfectly, we didn't know exactly what we were doing, but we got through it. And afterward we didn't feel guilt. Not like you'd think. We didn't stay up all night crying, wringing our hands, asking, 'What have we done?'" She smirked again. "No, it was intoxicating." Ortega uncrossed his arms and stepped closer. "Intoxicating," he repeated, his voice low with disgust. "That's a hell of a word to describe killing people." Lisa didn't flinch. "It's the right word," she confirmed. "There's this clarity you feel afterward. You realize you've crossed the line and nothing happens. The world keeps spinning. Nobody notices. Nobody cares. That's when Jack and I knew this wasn't just about money. It wasn't about scraping by. It was about something bigger, something deeper." "You're talking about murder like it's a hobby," Ortega snapped, slamming his hand down on the table. "That's what it became," Lisa replied smoothly, unfazed by his aggression. "A hobby, a thrill, something that made the days feel less empty." The desire for control. Collins caught her breath and leaned closer, trying to wrest control of the conversation. "What kind of person needs to kill to feel alive?" she asked sharply, trying to pierce through Lisa's calm facade. Lisa's eyes darted to Collins, her smirk widening like someone revealing the punchline to a dark joke. "It's not about needing to kill, Detective. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had real power? Not in the life or death sense, but the kind of power that makes you feel untouchable? Like all the rules suddenly don't apply to you?" Collins didn't answer. Ortega sneered. "Let me guess. That's how you justify this? Killing people gave you that kind of power, so it's all excusable." Lisa shrugged. "Call it what you want, but yeah, that's what it was. The high isn't from the act itself. It's from knowing we could do it. Knowing we got away with it every single time. Once you realize that, it becomes addictive, I guess. The planning, the execution, the cleanup, even the silence after. It all feeds the same beast. Addictive. A freaking beast," Ortega muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. He turned to Collins. "This woman isn't just a killer, she's a damn psychopath." The role of the relationship. Collins caught the small twitch in Lisa's expression at Ortega's words. "And where does Jack fit into all this?" she asked softly, steering the focus back. "You said this started as his idea, but it sounds like you evolved it." Lisa's face shifted slightly, her smirk tightening into something harder, colder. "Jack and I were good together. We balanced each other out. He handled the sweet-talking, the manipulation, the luring. I handled the aftermath. He needed me and I needed him. It was perfect." "Perfect," Collins repeated, folding her arms. Her voice dripped with disdain. "Because you could cheer each other on while you slaughtered people?" "To put it bluntly, yes," Lisa replied unbothered. "Most couples bond over a trip to Paris or a shared pet. Jack and I bonded over this, and every time we pulled it off we got closer, more in sync. We didn't just survive together, we thrived." Collins almost felt her stomach turn at those words, at the chillingly casual nature of how Lisa described their relationship. "The crime is recreational." "You didn't just kill for survival, you turned it into sport," Ortega said, taking control of the conversation again. His voice cracked momentarily as he processed the level of depravity they were dealing with. "You think this makes you clever, don't you? You and Jack, untouchable, living on your own damn twisted island. But you're sitting here now, Lisa, chained to a table. How untouchable do you feel now?" Lisa leaned back slightly, angling her head toward Ortega with her signature smug grin. "We knew it wouldn't last forever," she admitted with a light shrug. "What high ever does? Jack and I, We didn't kill because we wanted to get away with it forever. We killed because it made life feel less ordinary. Collins blinked, stunned at her audacity. Less ordinary? You butchered human beings to make your dull little life more interesting? Is that what you're telling us? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Lisa replied without hesitation. Her voice carried no shame, no regret. We saw what the world really was. Boring, routine, pointless. The same story every single day. Wake up, go to work, pay bills, die, killing. It was the only real thing we ever did. The inevitable fall. And yet, here you sit, Ortega said, stepping close to the table, his voice dangerously low. Here you are, Jack's in the wind, letting you take the fall, and you're trying to make this sound like some philosophical journey. Lisa, none of this excuses you. None of it. Lisa's smirk faltered for just a second at Jack's name, but she caught herself. Jack and I both knew the risks. If this is where it ends, she shrugged, so be it. But don't think for a second you can scare me with that talk about him leaving me behind. What we had, it's not something you'll ever understand. You're right about that, Collins said coldly, standing up. We don't understand people like you, and we don't want to. They loved the game, but they lost. The room finally fell silent, Lisa's words still hanging in the air like smoke. Ortega turned to Collins, his fists clenched tight. As they left the interrogation room, Lisa stayed behind, her smirk all but burned into their memories. She doesn't just lack remorse, Collins muttered as they reached their desks. She enjoyed it, thrived on it. Ortega nodded slowly. She thought the game was worth the cost, but guess what? She lost. He glanced back at the interrogation room door. And she doesn't even care. Compelling evidence. The crime videos. The evidence room detectives. Miguel Ortega and Sarah Collins sat in the dimly lit evidence room, a laptop open on the steel table between them. The air hung heavy, the kind of silence that made every creak of the chair or tap of the keyboard sound deafening. Officer Miles, their IT specialist, stood behind them, his face pale as he glanced at the screen. This is it, Miles said, his voice uneasy. This is the footage we pulled from the laptop in Jack and Lisa's apartment. Most of it's corrupt or scrambled, guess they didn't have time to fully wipe it, but what's left is, well, you'll see. Collins cast a glance at Ortega, her jaw tightening. How bad are we talking? She asked, her tone steady, though there was a flicker of tension in her eyes. Miles hesitated, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. Let's just say once you see this, you're not going to forget it. Play it, Ortega said brusquely, leaning forward. His fists were clenched on the table, the muscles in his arms taut like coiled springs. The videos begin. The first clip started with scrambled static before the screen resolved into a poorly lit room. Jack and Lisa's apartment unmistakably. It was the kitchen, captured from an angle that suggested a hidden camera. A figure could be seen on screen, Jack Miller, pacing with a predatory calmness. He was wearing black gloves and a stained t-shirt, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Collins leaned in, her brow furrowed. Pause it, look at his stance, she muttered. He's waiting for something. Miles paused the video, and Ortega let out an audible sigh, shaking his head. He doesn't look rushed or panicked. This guy's comfortable in it, Sarah. He looks like he's done this 100 times. Miles clicked play again, and the video continued. The sound was grainy, but the faint hum of Lisa's voice could be heard in the background, distorted slightly. Another figure entered the frame. It was one of their victims, a disheveled man who looked homeless, wearing a dirty coat and clutching a plastic shopping bag. He was visibly nervous but didn't seem to realize the danger. Watch Jack, Collins said lowly, her voice barely above a whisper. He's scanning him, looking for the weaknesses. In the video, Jack spoke softly to the man, handing him a mug of something, coffee, Collins guessed. The man laughed faintly, his demeanor relaxing slightly as he sat down at the small kitchen table. It was disarming, welcoming, normal. And then Lisa entered the frame, Lisa's ice-cold composure. Look at her posture, Ortega muttered, pointing to Lisa. She's not just his sidekick, she knows her role. Lisa was holding what seemed to be a folded blanket, her steps light and calculated. She walked behind the man, smiling faintly as she placed one hand on his shoulder. The camera caught her face as she smiled, a hollow, predatory expression that sent chills down Collins's spine. I'll get you one of these to take with you. Lisa's voice in the video crackled through. It gets cold out there. Christ, Collins whispered under her breath, feeling sick, as Lisa stepped out of frame. The next sequence wasn't as subtle. The victim's movements became lethargic. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to lift the mug again. "They drugged him," Collins said quietly. "Right there. It's in the coffee." Jack leaned toward his victim, his persona shifting completely. His calm demeanor dissolved into something more animalistic, a casual kind of cruelty. He tapped his gloved hand on the table, watching the man slump forward. The clip ended in a burst of static. "There's more." Miles cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting from one foot to the other. "That's just the first clip. There's more. You want me to keep going?" "Play it," Ortega ordered, though the weight in his voice suggested he already regretted the words. The next clip began instantaneously, the same shaky footage but now in the apartment's living room. The man from the previous clip was lying on the floor, barely conscious. Lisa was standing above him, holding what appeared to be a small utility knife in her hand. She turned to Jack, whose face twisted into something resembling delight. "You sure about this one?" Jack's voice crackled through the speaker. "Looks like he wouldn't last too long anyway." "We'll make it quick," Lisa replied, crouching down. She tilted her head slightly, staring at the camera as if she knew it was there, as if she were speaking directly to whoever would eventually watch the footage. Her voice was calm, collected. "Quick, but memorable. A glimpse into their psyche." Ortega slammed his hand on the table. "Pause it!" he barked, his voice echoing in the small room. "Jesus Christ!" Miles froze the video, the still frame showing Lisa's cold expression staring into the lens. Her face was eerily calm, almost as if she were posing. "Memorable?" Collins asked under her breath, her voice strained. She closed her eyes for half a second, gathering herself. "These two, they're not just killers, Miguel. They're performers. They're documenting this like it's art." Ortega leaned back in his chair, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the table. "It's not art, it's sick, and they wanted us to find this. They wanted someone to see it." The final clip. "There's one more," Miles said softly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "This one's worse." "Worse?" Collins echoed, unsure if her stomach could handle any more. Miles clicked play, and what followed was nothing short of horrifying. The final video was recorded from a handheld device, shakier than the hidden camera footage. The frame was closer, more intimate, showing both Jack and Lisa standing behind another victim. This one was younger, maybe in his early 20s. His face was turned away, but his muffled cries of fear filled the space. "You have any idea how lucky you are?" Jack's voice came through, cold and taunting. He leaned close to his victim, grabbing his hair and forcing him upright. "Lisa's the one who picked you." Lisa stepped closer to the camera, her expression unreadable. "You're just a face in a crowd," she said softly, almost as if she were comforting him. "And when we're done, you'll be a name no one remembers." The video blurred as the scene became more chaotic, noises of struggle, the victim's desperate sounds, Jack's laughter, Lisa's silence. Then, abruptly, the camera fell sideways, resting at an angle that still captured them, their silhouettes against the dim apartment light. The footage abruptly cut to black, the moment it sank in. The room went silent as the video ended. Miles slowly closed the laptop, unable to meet Collins or Ortega's eyes. They documented everything," Collins said quietly, almost to herself. "All of it, like trophies." "They weren't just murderers," Ortega muttered. "They were sadists. This wasn't just practical, this was their legacy." Collins finally turned to Miles. "We need forensic copies of all of this, every second. Get this to the DA. These videos, they're everything we need." Miles nodded stiffly, stepping out of the room. Ortega and Collins sat there for a long moment, their minds heavy with what they'd just seen. "This isn't over." "She didn't just confess to us," Collins said finally, breaking the silence. "She confessed to the camera, to the world. She wanted this part of her story to survive." "Yeah," Ortega agreed, his tone laced with anger. "And now it's our job to make sure it buries her." Public outrage and the death sentence. The trial of the century begins. The courthouse buzzed with tension. News vans lined the streets outside, their satellite dishes pointed like weapons toward the gray sky. Protesters held signs aloft, some demanding justice for the victims while others condemned the death penalty altogether. It was chaos outside, but inside the courtroom, an eerie silence hung in the air. Detective Miguel Ortega adjusted his tie as he entered the courtroom, glancing briefly at the packed gallery. Sarah Collins was already seated at the prosecution's table, flipping through her notes. The back of the room was stuffed with reporters, their pens poised to capture every word, every facial twitch. "It's a circus out there," Ortega muttered, leaning toward her. "Let them watch," Collins replied calmly but firmly. She didn't look up, her pen scratching quickly across the paper. "People want answers, and they deserve to see these two monsters go down." Lisa on trial. All eyes turned when Lisa Carter, dressed in a plain gray jumpsuit, was escorted into the courtroom. Shackles clinked with every step, but she moved with a deliberate calm, her head held high. That same eerie smirk rested on her lips, the one reporters had splashed across every front page for the past 6 months. To her, this wasn't a trial. It was a show. Sitting at the table next to her court-appointed lawyer, Lisa turned her head slightly, scanning the crowd. Her eyes landed on Ortega and Collins at the prosecution's table, and her smirk widened, just enough to make Ortega's blood boil. "Look at her," Ortega muttered under his breath. Collins didn't take her eyes off her notes. "Don't let her get to you, Miguel. She's playing games, but by the end of this, it won't matter. The jury's already disgusted just seeing her walk in." The judge slammed his gavel, and the noise brought the room to attention. "Court is now in session," he announced. "The people versus Lisa Carter." The prosecutor's argument. The lead prosecutor, Ellen Parker, was a seasoned attorney known for her no-nonsense demeanor. She stood, adjusting her blazer, and approached the jury, her tone steady and sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice carrying through the courtroom. "Today, you sit in judgment over one of the most horrendous crimes ever committed in this city. Lisa Carter and her partner Jack Miller didn't just steal lives, they stole dignity. Over and over again, they targeted society's most vulnerable, luring them in with promises of safety, only to inflict unimaginable horror. These are not crimes of desperation, they are crimes of pleasure." She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle over the room. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "You will see the evidence. You will watch the videos they filmed, where Lisa Carter actively participated, not as someone coerced, but as someone who enjoyed what she was doing. This trial isn't just about punishment, it's about ensuring that monsters like Lisa Carter can never harm another soul again. And the only fitting punishment for her actions," Parker leaned forward toward the jury, "is the ultimate one, the death penalty." Lisa speaks. It wasn't long before the defense called Lisa to the stand. The room charged with tension as she rose from her seat, shackles clinking once more. The gallery leaned forward collectively, some out of morbid curiosity, others out of sheer loathing. Her attorney, Michael Bowers, approached her cautiously, as if hesitant to be standing so close. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice soft, "can you explain to the court your role in these events? Were you acting under Jack Miller's influence?" Lisa tilted her head, her smirk flickering as if deciding how much she wanted to toy with the room. "Jack didn't make me do anything," she said flatly, her voice calm and measured. Gasps rippled through the courtroom and a faint murmur of whispers broke out. "Order!" the judge barked, pounding the gavel. Lisa continued, unbothered. "I wasn't some helpless victim. I knew what we were doing every step of the way. I didn't mind it. In fact, I liked it." The room erupted. One woman stood up from the gallery, pointing a trembling finger at Lisa. "You're a monster!" she shrieked before being escorted out by security. Television cameras captured every second, and within hours the footage would dominate the evening news cycle. Bowers looked like he might collapse. "Lisa, please!" "No!" she snapped, cutting him off. She leaned back in her chair, looking straight at the jury. "They all act like they're better than me. But deep down, everyone's capable of what I did. Everyone's got darkness inside them. I was just honest about mine." Collins closed her notebook, her hands trembling slightly. "She's digging her own grave," she whispered to Ortega. He nodded grimly. "Let her. The jury needs to see what she really is." The media frenzy outside the courthouse, chaos reigned. Protesters clashed in the streets, some calling for Lisa's immediate execution, others holding signs that read, "No to death row, justice without death." News anchors scrambled to piece commentary together, while psychologists gave televised interviews dissecting Lisa's psyche. "She's the very definition of a sociopath," proclaimed Dr. Helen Brewster, a forensic psychologist appearing on a primetime panel. Her complete lack of remorse, combined with her disturbing need for control and pleasure in others' pain, makes her one of the most dangerous individuals I've ever encountered. Across from her, a legal analyst argued, "It's not about her psychology. The public wants closure. If we can't give these families justice, what message does that send? The death penalty exists for people like Lisa Carter." The jury's verdict. After weeks of testimony, it took the jury less than 5 hours to return with a unanimous verdict. Lisa Carter sat emotionless as the foreperson stood, holding the paper with trembling hands. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Lisa Carter, guilty." Gasps echoed through the gallery, followed almost immediately by cheers. Outside, the gathered crowds erupted in a mix of celebration and fury. The judge wasted no time. "Miss Carter, for your role in the brutal murders of 6 innocent victims, this court sentences you to death by lethal injection." Ortega exhaled sharply, his fingers gripping the edge of the prosecution table. Collins didn't move, her eyes locked on Lisa, who simply leaned back in her chair, as calm as ever. Lisa's last words. As Lisa was escorted out of the courtroom, reporters screamed questions, their cameras flashing wildly. "Do you feel remorse, Lisa?" one shouted. "Do you regret what you've done?" yelled another. Lisa turned her head slightly, offering the cameras one last smirk. "No regrets," she said, her tone as cold as the winter air outside. "None at all." Reflections. Back at the precinct, Ortega and Collins sat in silence for a long moment. The trial was over. Justice had been served. But neither of them could shake the weight of what they had witnessed, not just the crimes but Lisa's twisted indifference toward them. "She didn't just die a monster," Ortega finally said. "She lived one, and she wanted the world to know it." Collins nodded, staring out the window. "And now she'll never hurt anyone again. That's the only closure we'll ever get." Community reaction. The aftermath, outside the courthouse. It had been 3 days since the verdict was handed down, but the streets outside the courthouse remained alive with emotion. Protesters, victims' families, curious onlookers, and camera crews packed the sidewalks, creating a cacophony of clashing voices and flashing lights. Some held up signs reading "Justice at Last," while others screamed slogans denouncing the death penalty. "Killing a killer is still killing." Detective Miguel Ortega approached the courthouse steps, his partner Sarah Collins beside him. Their role in the trial had thrust them into the public eye, but neither seemed to relish the attention. A throng of reporters immediately swarmed them. Microphones thrust forward like spears, desperate for comments. "Detectives, does the guilty verdict bring you closure?" one yelled over the crowd. "How do you feel about Lisa Carter's lack of remorse? Do you think she'll ever show regret?" asked another. Ortega stopped, his hand raised to silence the chaos. He spoke in a deep, measured voice, his tone resolute. "This case was never about us. It was about justice for those 6 victims who didn't have a voice. Let's not forget them in all of this." Collins nodded, adding firmly, "What Lisa Carter felt or didn't feel is irrelevant. The jury saw her for what she is. That's what matters." The reporters continued shouting questions, but the 2 detectives pushed through the crowd. Collins whispered as they walked off, "It's like everyone forgot there are real families grieving right now." "That's the thing about people," Ortega replied. "They love the drama, they love the monsters. The victims? Just part of the story." The families speak out. Inside a small church hall not far from the courthouse, several family members of the victims had gathered, away from the media frenzy. A makeshift memorial lined one side of the room, with photographs of the victims framed by flickering candles. Young, bright faces now lost forever. Flowers and handwritten notes of sympathy sat below each frame. Brenda Ortiz, whose younger brother Javier had been one of Lisa and Jack's victims, stood at the front of the room, clutching a photograph of him. Her voice trembled as she addressed the group. "Javi was just trying to survive," she said, her breath hitching. The room was silent, except for the muffled sobs of another grieving parent in the back. "He didn't deserve to end up in their apartment. He didn't deserve to be treated like garbage, like he didn't matter." Brenda paused, tears spilling down her cheeks. "And now everyone's talking about her, the murderer, like she's some kind of celebrity. All those articles, all those interviews, don't they realize they're giving her what she wanted?" An older man, Paul Jacobs, rose slowly from his chair. His son was also one of the victims. His voice, though weathered with age, carried anger. "You're right, Brenda, but that's what this world does, turns killers into headline stories, flashy news segments, TV specials. In the meantime, my son, your brother, they're just names people forget." He slammed his fist on the nearest table. "I want those people to remember who this is about. I want them to remember the lives, not the monster." Social media divided online, the response to the case had spiraled into a wildfire of opinions. Hashtags like #JusticeForTheVictims and #Lisa Carter Execution trended for days, igniting fierce debates across every platform. On one side, users celebrated the verdict as a victory for justice. On the other side, anti-death penalty activists questioned the morality of the sentence. To many, the most disturbing part wasn't just Lisa's crimes, it was the idea that someone could commit such horrors and still smile about it in court. Viral clips of Lisa's cold smirk and her chilling statement, No regrets, none at all, spread like wildfire with millions of views on TikTok and YouTube. Comment sections swelled with outrage and horror. A neighborhood forever changed while the internet raged. The neighborhood where Jack and Lisa's apartment had been located remained eerily quiet. Many residents had already moved away, unwilling to live in a building tainted by such heinous crimes. The landlord had boarded up the infamous basement apartment, but that didn't stop occasional thrill-seekers or reporters from showing up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the scene where it all happened. One longtime resident, Mrs. Evelyn Morrison, spoke to a local news crew. "I've lived here for 30 years. 30 years, she repeated, shaking her head. "And I never thought we'd see something like this. That smell, that awful smell from the drain, I still can't get it out of my head. Those poor souls. They were right under our feet, and we didn't even know it." Another neighbor, David Gomez, added, "We called the cops about that smell for months. Months! And they brushed us off. Imagine if they'd acted sooner. Maybe those people would still be alive. It makes me sick." Town hall meeting, a cry for change. A week after the trial, City Council held a public forum. The room erupted as concerned citizens packed tight rows of chairs, desperate to voice their fears and frustrations. "This isn't just about Lisa Carter," shouted one attendee, an older woman with an air of indignation. "This is about every single person on these streets who's been failed by this city. Those victims were homeless, vulnerable, invisible, and the system let them fall through the cracks." A young man stood next, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "It's not like people like Jack and Lisa just appear out of nowhere. They were living right under our noses, and no one did a damn thing until it was too late." Representatives from local organizations working with the homeless community tried to calm the room, but the anger and despair were palpable. Many demanded stronger protections for the city's vulnerable population, arguing that better outreach and resources might have saved lives. Reflections from the detectives. Late that evening, back at the precinct, Ortega and Collins sat silently in the break room, their coffee growing cold. The weight of the public's outrage, and their role in the case, had taken its toll. "I keep thinking about what that woman at the town hall said," Collins finally broke the silence. "How did this happen? How did they get away with it for so long?" Ortega sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because no one pays attention to people like their victims, Sarah. Even when they started disappearing, no one noticed fast enough. By the time the smell came up from the pipes, it was already too late." Collins swirled her untouched coffee, her expression distant. "It's not just Lisa and Jack who failed them. It's everyone. The system. Us. All of it." Ortega straightened, a grim determination settling into his features. "We can't change what happened, but we can damn sure make sure something like this never happens again." The station, late at night. The clock on the wall ticked quietly in the precinct's break room, though neither Ortega nor Collins paid it any mind. The trial was over. The media frenzy was calming down. Lisa Carter had been sentenced, and Jack Miller was still in federal custody, awaiting his hearing. And yet, as Ortega stared blankly at his untouched coffee, Collins sat across from him, flipping a pen between her fingers. A heavy silence hung between them. "We caught them," she finally said, breaking the quiet. "The city's safe again. Or at least that's what everyone keeps saying on TV. Ortega let out a dry laugh, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, the city's just fine, until the next Lisa and Jack show up." Collins looked up sharply, her brow furrowed. "You think someone else like them is out there?" Ortega leaned back in his chair, his exhaustion showing. "Doesn't it feel that way? Every time we close a case like this, it's not relief I feel, it's dread, because all it takes is one more ticking time bomb, one more pair of monsters just waiting to step into the spotlight." Reflections on Lisa's psychology. Collins placed the pen down, folding her hands in front of her. "Lisa wasn't just someone broken, though. People keep trying to blame her childhood or bad luck or bad influences, but that doesn't explain her." She hesitated, then added, "This was a choice, Miguel. Every single thing she did, it was purposeful, calculated." "I know," Ortega said, his voice low. "That's what scares me. You look at people like her, and you want to believe they're born that way, that it's rare, unnatural, but I don't think that's the truth. I think Lisa became who she was because no one stopped her when she started. No one saw her." Collins nodded slowly, her stare distant. "And Jack brought out the worst in her. You could see it in the evidence. Every time they got away with a crime, she dug deeper, pushed further, like she was testing how far the world would let her go. That's the part no one on the news will talk about." Ortega straightened in his chair, his voice growing harder. "Where were we? Where was the system when their victims started disappearing? Months of reports, complaints about smells, strange noises, something being wrong in that building. And what did we do? Nothing. We show up when it's too late, when they've already got 6 bodies in the drain and grins on their faces in court. A system that fails its people. Collins leaned forward, resting her head in her hands. It's not just the police, Miguel. It's everything. Social services, shelters, mental health systems. We're stretched thin everywhere, so when someone like Lisa or Jack slips through the cracks, it just gets chalked up as another tragedy. Ortega shook his head, frustration etched on his face. They didn't just slip through the cracks, that's what everyone wants to say because it's easier, but Lisa and Jack didn't fall. They were ignored. Their victims, ignored. Nobody cared because the people they killed were homeless, forgotten. And invisible, Collins added quietly. They picked people no one checks on, no family looking for them, no friends noticing when they stop showing up. That's why they got away with it for so long. Ortega's jaw clenched. And now everyone's walking around saying justice has been served because Lisa got the death penalty. But none of that brings back the men and women who trusted them, who thought they'd found a safe place for one night. He let out a bitter sigh. We failed. As much as everyone wants to cheer about the verdict, we failed them. A conversation about humanity's darkness. Collins looked at him thoughtfully. Do you think we're all capable of this? The darkness Lisa kept talking about in court, that everyone has it, but she admitted hers. Ortega stared at her for a moment before answering. I don't know. I'd like to say no. I'd like to believe people aren't like her. But maybe what Lisa understood, and what kept her calm this whole time, is that most people don't want to admit how easy it is to cross the line. All it takes is enough anger, enough desperation, or the right person pulling you down. Lisa didn't find the darkness. She embraced it, the way she and Jack fed off each other. That's what made the difference. Empathy, Collins offered softly, her voice tinged with sorrow. That's what draws the line, right? They didn't have it, Miguel. They didn't care about anyone but themselves. And if there's no empathy, there's no limit to what someone can do. Ortega raised his coffee mug but didn't drink. He swirled the liquid absently, his gaze distant. Just hope we don't live in a world where the Lisas and Jacks start outnumbering the rest of us. The public response, a wake-up call. As they spoke, the echoes of the city outside seeped into the precinct. The trial of Lisa Carter and Jack Miller had ignited widespread discussions, not just about justice, but about the growing cracks in society. City leaders pontificated on learning from failures in press conferences, promising reforms that often felt hollow. Protesters filled parks and squares, splintered into shouting matches between those decrying systemic failures and those discussing morality and capital punishment. On social media, endless debates raged. Lisa didn't just come out of nowhere. She's what happens when society ignores mental health and human decency for too long. We created her. You can reform systems all you want, but evil like hers doesn't come from the system. It comes from the person. Let's stop pretending she's the victim. Others centered around the victim's invisibility. We don't care about the homeless until it's too late. Are those 6 lives worth nothing until they're a headline? If we had treated those people, those humans, like they mattered, Jack and Lisa wouldn't have had the chance to do this. This isn't just their crime, it's ours. A broader lesson. Collins eventually tilted her chair back, breaking the tense mood. The scary part is, Lisa's not even unique, she murmured. There's hundreds of people like her waiting for their opportunity. If it's not murder, it's fraud, abuse, trafficking. Monsters don't start like monsters. They're shaped by the world around them. And unchecked, they thrive, Ortega said. He shook his head. Maybe the only difference between Lisa and others like her is Lisa wanted to be seen. She left her breadcrumbs to make a point. I just don't know what the point was. Collins exhaled heavily. Control, she said. It was always about control. Over her victims, over Jack, even over us during her trial. Lisa always wanted to hold the power, and she hated so much of the world for taking it away from her before she found this outlet, a call to act. The 2 detectives sat in silence for a beat as the weight of their words settled. Maybe it's time the world learned Lisa's real lesson, Collins said eventually. We can keep punishing monsters like her after the fact, keep telling ourselves justice is served, but until we stop creating a culture full of victims, people no one cares to protect or notice, the cycle keeps spinning. Ortega gave her a long, quiet look. Then, with bitter honesty, he replied, I think Lisa already knows the world isn't ready to change. That's why she smiled at her sentencing. She knows she won. Not while we're still on the job, Collins said firmly.